Nazi concentration camps hide within their walls the most sinister acts that humanity has ever known. And Bergen-Belsen, in northern Germany, was no exception. This was the first to be liberated by Allied forces. Until then, the only descriptions of what happened in these places were from the Red Army, made up of soldiers from the Soviet Union who had seen with their own eyes the horrors of these temples of death established within Poland. The combatants knew that the Third Reich was brutal in battle, but they found it hard to believe some of the stories told by Stalin's men. However, to their surprise, what they found was even worse. Possibly the concentration camps of World War II were the scene of the most atrocious crimes of humanity. And in this new video, we will go through the history of one of the most fearsome. We warn you, the images and stories that we are going to see in the next few minutes are incredibly brutal. But if you're ready to discover everything that the victims of the Bergen-Belsen camp endured, including one well-known figure who died there, then sit back, because we're already getting started.
Wreszcie najstraszniejszy, najokropniejszy obóz, jaki przeżyłem, to jest Bergen-Belsen. Sceny nie do opisania. Chcąc uwierzyć, trzeba być na miejscu i wszystko widzieć. Trupy, trupy i jeszcze raz trupy.
The Nazi regime, led by Adolf Hitler, always had concentration camps among its tools, which were created in 1933 as facilities to guard and restrict the freedom of the enemies of the Führer's ideology. At first, the paramilitary organization of the Third Reich, known as the SS and led by Heinrich Himmler, detained mostly political opponents, largely members of the Communist Party, and to them were added criminals, the so-called asocials who did not identify with any thought, and some Jews. That was the basis for the structure that would take on great relevance after the outbreak of the Second World War. However, each camp also has its own particular history, and in this case, we will learn about that of Bergen-Belsen. In 1935, 4 years before the start of the war, its facilities were used to test the range and autonomy of the deadly German armored vehicles. The two small towns between which it was located gave its name to the place that fell into disuse between 1938 and 1939. However, when the Nazis invaded Poland, the German armed forces, better known as the Wehrmacht, began using the space as a camp for prisoners of that particular conflict. Its facilities quickly became full. There were a large number of detainees, which required a lot of work and represented several mouths to feed. Before the full-scale war with the rest of Europe began, this center housed 95,000 men, including opponents of Nazism, communists, homosexuals, gypsies, and even Jehovah's Witnesses. As if that were not enough, in June 1940, when Hitler's famous Lightning War, or Blitzkrieg, began to dominate much of the territory around Germany, Bergen-Belsen housed the first French and Belgian prisoners. A year later, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the camp had to expand its facilities and was already beginning to show Nazi brutality.
Approximately 2,500 Russians died at this camp in a one-month period. One bit of sport which the Nazi commandant indulged in was to turn loose German police dogs for attacks on the physically handicapped who were unable to report promptly for the daily inspection.
Although the camp's capacity had been expanded, the number of people arriving meant that the camp could never cope, and overcrowding was common. The new design was designed to hold 20,000 prisoners, but it was quickly overwhelmed. By the end of March 1942, 41,000 detainees had already died in the complex, from the Soviet Union alone. They were victims of hunger, exhaustion, and disease, but Bergen-Belsen remained outside the initiative that was called the Final Solution. This was the Nazi plan to eliminate all the Jews in Europe, which used gas chambers as the main means to achieve its goal. However, the camp we are referring to did not have one of them. In fact, the operation was different in terms of dealing with this specific population that was intended to be annihilated. While in places like Auschwitz, transports of Jews arrived ready to be taken to their death by poisoning with a powerful pesticide that was used in the chambers. What happened in Bergen-Belsen was that Jews were housed to be exchanged for civilians, or German soldiers, who had been captured by the enemy. Between the summer of 1943 and December 1944, at least 14,600 Jews were transported to this camp. They were all forced to work in the war efforts of the Third Reich. They were slave labor, at first not too badly treated because the Nazis saw in these detainees a particular and potential exchange value. However, consideration had a limit for the supposed kindness of the Nazis. Within the complex, they had created a space called recovery. It was a great irony, since prisoners too sick to work were sent there from other concentration camps. The intention, at least formally, was to restore strength and health in order to return to their forced labor as soon as possible. But most of them died in Bergen-Belsen from hunger, exhaustion, and lack of medical attention for their ailments.
Some have gangrenous wounds. Others suffer from fever, tuberculosis, typhus, and additional communicable diseases. All existed under appalling conditions in vermin-infested quarters and with little or nothing to eat.
By 1944, part of the facilities had been adapted to house a women's camp, which received an initial shipment of 9,000 prisoners. Many of them very young girls, almost all deported after the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto, the largest confinement space for Jews established by Nazi Germany. Other women also arrived from the rest of Poland and Hungary. They were all destined to work in the manufacture of weapons to support the troops of the Third Reich. But the changes in the camp did not only occur among the detainees and new inmates. In December of that same year, the first commander of Bergen-Belsen, Adolf Haas, was replaced by another member of the SS who had been the greatest authority in Auschwitz. This was Josef Kramer, who was a true expert in the task of murdering prisoners. He arrived prepared to face a reality that had been experienced for some time: the entry of prisoners in droves in a complex too small to house them all. He thus decided to eliminate as many of them as possible as a solution to his problem, easily summarizing the cruelty of the Germans. These images show, without leaving any room for doubt, that this type of complex housed the most aberrant acts in history. It was with Kramer as commander that Bergen-Belsen ceased to be considered simply a facility to house prisoners, and officially became a Nazi SS concentration camp. Under his guidance, the facilities were expanded again. However, by January 1945, the camps in Eastern Europe began to be evacuated in the face of the advance of the Red Army, and at least 85,000 people were transported in cattle cars to the complex in Germany. Many were sent on foot, but a large part were unable to withstand the long and hard march due to their state of deterioration caused by their stay in the camps of the Third Reich. As if that were not enough, those who arrived had to continue fighting for their lives. Bergen-Belsen had become a hell where everything was prepared to kill you. From the lack of food and hygiene, the brutality of the guards, and even the diseases and the doctors who, far from alleviating these illnesses, experimented on the prisoners. All of this was recorded in the memory of the people who managed to escape this hell alive, and who had the opportunity to tell their torment after being released.
Wir waren 1500 in einem Zimmer, sehr schmutzig und sehr gedrängt haben wir sich. Und ohne Essen, ohne Wasser und überhaupt, das war kein Leben für uns. Wir haben gedacht, dass wir schon das Überleben nicht mehr.
Only those who overcame all these obstacles could have any hope of seeing with their own eyes the fall of Nazism, which was drawing ever closer. To put into perspective the last months of chaos in Bergen-Belsen before the end of the war, we can look at some numbers. In February 1945, there were approximately 22,000 prisoners in the camp. But with the arrival of detainees evacuated from the compounds on the front lines of the conflict where the enemy was advancing, by mid-April the figure had exceeded 60,000 people. Furthermore, we must bear in mind that in the same period, tens of thousands died, so the total number of victims of Nazi cruelty around this camp was close to around 100,000 people, just in this small stretch of history, which ended on April 15, 1945, with the arrival of British forces. This was how Allied troops liberated a concentration camp from the Nazis for the first time.
Während wir Sie durch dieses Lager führen, müssen Sie sich zwei Dinge von Augen halten. Erstens, dass wir, die Engländer, bereits 10 Tage hier gewesen sind. Wir hoffen, alle Toten aus den Baracken fortgeschafft zu haben.
The second was to enlist the help of the SS guards to obtain information about what was happening in this hellish place. Although they had already formed an idea in their minds just by entering and finding a place full of corpses, as well as thousands of other prisoners who could barely move to distinguish themselves from the dead. An emblematic example of this was the case of the Hungarian artist Katharina Hardy. The violinist had been captured for being Jewish and was in Bergen-Belsen when the British forces broke in. When the soldiers found her, the young woman, barely 16 years old at the time, weighed 29 kilos. She was lying on the floor with her legs bent and could not stretch them or have the energy to get up. She was also unable to swallow, and therefore it was impossible for her to eat. She had been in this state for weeks and was quickly transferred to a military hospital. There she was able to regain some weight and begin to improve. She managed to be one of the survivors and avoid being just another number among the victims for whom these Nazis now had to answer.
Heute ist der 23. April 1945. Ich bin der Oberscharführer, der SS-Oberscharführer Friedrich Herzog aus Dortmund in Westfalen und bin 2 Jahre hier im Lager.
Men like this went from being guards to prisoners of the Allied forces and accused of the greatest atrocities. In fact, Katharina Hardy herself, once she recovered, explained what it was like to be locked up in the concentration camp. Life was not normal. Death was normal. I don't see the world as others see it. In reality, I belong to the dead of Bergen-Belsen. The woman thought that there was a palpable presence of the afterlife, due to the fact that she saw corpses everywhere, every day, in addition to constant shootings to execute those who could no longer perform forced labor, and the guards decided to kill. Life was the exception in this complex, and that fact impacted and transformed all the prisoners who passed through there. Another example comes from the testimony of T0RTURE, a Polish citizen who managed to avoid the gas chamber at Auschwitz, but was sent to Bergen-Belsen for her end. When we arrived, we were told to go into a huge empty hut with no beds, mattresses, or blankets, nothing. With openings for windows but no glass. We found a corner with my mother and fell asleep, exhausted. Early in the morning, I woke up and couldn't believe what I saw. Skeletons walking, in every sense of the word.
Montones
Piles
de
of
cuerpos
bodies piled
apilados,
up,
montañas.
mountains. You couldn't tell if they were women or men. It's hard to describe how terrible it was, she said. And the same story was repeated no matter who told it.
Es ist mir schwer zu beschreiben, das alles, was wir Häftlinge hier in den Lager mitgemacht haben. Als nur kleine Beweisen kann ich erzählen, dass man hat uns Häftlinge in einem schmutzigen, verlausten Lager auf der Erde geschmissen, Tausende auf eine nur Erde, ohne Decken, ohne Strohsäcke, ohne Betten. Man hat uns als Essen einen 12. Teil vom Brot gegeben, 1 Liter Steckrübensuppe täglich.
As mentioned above, this concentration camp was found to have about 60,000 people inside at the time of liberation. Most of these prisoners were seriously ill. Thousands of corpses remained unburied within the confines of the complex, and this was an attenuating factor for various ailments due to the unhygienic conditions. More than 10,000 of the detainees who were rescued were in such a state of disrepair that despite efforts to save them, they ended up dying. Although they were released, the Germans were responsible and were forced by British forces to remedy this by working to care for the fragile victims.
The staff of German nurses is also forced to attend the victims. The women are able to smile for the first time in years.
The darkest period seemed to have ended for these female prisoners, but the consequences would accompany them for life, since they had been the target of brutal sterilization experiments. The Nazi plan was to prevent the Jewish population from continuing to procreate, either between couples or as a result of cruel rape by German guards, who subjected them to constant sexual abuse. The SS doctors were aware of Adolf Hitler's desire to preserve his beloved Aryan race, and so they began to look for different methods to prevent Hebrew women from having children. Among them, overexposure to X-rays, surgeries or injections with chemical irritants that caused severe inflammation, causing enormous pain and permanent damage to the reproductive organs were tested. In addition to all this suffering, many times the test subjects were killed to perform autopsies and compare results in different bodies. Now, women were not the only ones to suffer, because the Germans managed to have punishments for each of the prisoners. In fact, these were not the only stories that came to light after the liberation of this fearsome concentration camp.
Demonstrating how the victims were tied up for administering vicious beatings. A barbed wire stick was used on the backs of the men. Another method for rendering a patriot helpless while he was attacked by his Gestapo guards.
The torture at Bergen-Belsen was on a par with any other German concentration camp. But it must be remembered that this was the first camp to be liberated by Allied troops, so it was also the one that uncovered the brutal mysteries of the Nazi treatment of its prisoners. Soviet soldiers of the Red Army had already had contact with other complexes in occupied territories when they advanced from Eastern Europe. But the Western forces that began their journey towards Germany after the Normandy landings on French soil were still unaware of what was happening behind closed doors in these factories of death. For this reason, when they discovered it, the Americans led by General Dwight Eisenhower wanted to show the world the brutality that was taking place behind closed doors.
Former inmates demonstrate how they were tortured by the Nazis. American congressmen invited to view the atrocities were told by General Eisenhower, nothing is covered up. We have nothing to conceal. The barbarous treatment these people received in the German concentration camps is almost unbelievable. I want you to see for yourselves and be the spokesman for the United States.
By this time, the war was practically over. Just 2 weeks after the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen camp, Adolf Hitler took his own life to avoid being captured by Stalin's troops who had already entered Berlin. All the secrets of the Führer's atrocious regime were beginning to be revealed, although on some occasions, the Germans themselves, who had been part of the extensive killing machinery, claimed not to be aware of what was happening inside the detention camps. That is why the Americans, who wanted to establish the brutal crimes committed, added Nazi soldiers to the tours of the recently liberated complex, confronting them with the truth so that, whether they knew what it was about or not, they could feel and smell the death they had caused with so much pain in between.
These two are identified as slave labor bosses who maltreated, tortured, and killed their workers. Next, to the woodshed, which the Nazis are reluctant to enter, but Colonel Sears demands that they get a close-up look at the most gruesome of sights.
The delegations, which included representatives of the American government and the Germans, new prisoners of war, toured every corner of the camp that for years had been a hell for tens of thousands of Jews from all over Europe. The completely consumed corpses were the clearest reflection of the suffering that had been part of the detainees in Bergen-Belsen. But little by little, they also became aware of the conditions they had had to face before wishing for death as an escape from profound suffering. Among the places visited, they came to the site that was specially prepared to burn the piles of lifeless bodies and reduce the number that accumulated throughout the complex.
They are taken to the crematory 2 miles outside the camp, where the list of the atrocities is read for all to hear. 4,000 hors d'oeuvre victims are said to include Poles, Czechs, Russians, Belgians, Frenchmen, German Jews, and German political prisoners.
If we leave out the early years of the camp's operation, when it served as a space for holding prisoners of war, either from invaded Poland or those brought in after the occupation from France and Belgium, it is estimated that between 1943 and 1945, around 120,000 people passed through Bergen-Belsen. However, only about 55,000 of them were ever known by name, less than half. This is because the SS destroyed much of the archives before the defeat of Nazism. Only a few reports that had been suppressed ended up in the hands of the Allies. And although the data was scarce, it offered some clarity for the families of Holocaust victims who were searching for their loved ones in the hope of finding them alive.
Death books found hidden in the wine cellar of the Hadamar Institution revealed part of the story of the mass killings. The bulky volumes contained thousands of death certificates. Profession unknown, nationality unknown was written after each name.
Many of the former SS personnel were tried by the British at the Bergen-Belsen trial. During the period that it operated as a concentration camp, at least 480 people worked as guards or staff members at the complex, including 45 women. From 17 September to 17 November 1945, some of them were tried by a military court in Lüneburg. This included Commandant Josef Kramer, 16 men from the Nazi forces, 16 female guards, and 12 former heads of the different camp sectors. Many of the defendants were not only accused of crimes committed at this particular camp, but also of previous transgressions at Auschwitz. Substantial media coverage of the trial provided detailed information about the gas chambers at this complex on Polish soil, as well as the mass murders at Bergen-Belsen. 11 of the defendants were sentenced to death, including Kramer, and their hangings took place on December 13, 1945, in Hamelin. On the other hand, 14 ended up acquitted. Finally, of the remaining 20, one was sentenced to life imprisonment, but executed for another crime. And for the remaining 19, prison terms of 1 to 15 years were imposed. However, most of these cases were reduced on appeals or requests for clemency. As we approach the end of our video, we can assure you that the sentences paid by this small group of Nazis sound like little compared to the terrible suffering experienced by thousands of prisoners in that atrocious place. And as promised, we will tell you who was the person who spent her last days in Bergen-Belsen. It is Anne Frank, the young woman who became famous for her story of her time escaping from the Nazis. She was locked up with her family for 25 months in the back of a house in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and during that time, she wrote in a diary the most shocking things about that period. Her dreams, fears, and the brutal uncertainty of knowing how it would all end. Finally, she and her family were captured in August 1944 and sent to Auschwitz, but later, Anne was transferred to the concentration camp on German soil, where she died in February 1945 due to typhus. Gusen was one of the most brutal German concentration camps of World War II. It was built, with one motive in mind: the murder of those deemed inferior by the Nazis. Jews, communists, and enemy prisoners of war were transported there, never to know freedom again. But unlike other German extermination centers, gas chambers were rarely used at Gusen. Guards resorted to other sadistic methods to eliminate captives, seeking out those capable of causing terrible agony before death. From cruel experiments to drowning, nothing proved too extreme for Hitler's macabre men. Today, in this new military history video, we'll tell you all about Gusen, the brutal Nazi concentration camp.
They see the woodshed where lime-covered bodies are stacked in layers, and the stench is overpowering.
The construction of this terrible place took place before the start of World War II. By the latter half of the 1930s, Adolf Hitler was already comfortably in power in Germany. In defiance of international treaties that had been in place since the end of World War I, the Führer had ordered the modernization and expansion of the National Armed Forces. The army grew from 100,000 men to over 3 million, while aircraft, tanks, and heavy artillery began to be produced at a tremendous rate. Everything was in place to carry out the expansion plans that the Nazi leaders had devised, but the first conquests were made without bloodshed. Austria was the initial target. Most of its inhabitants were in favor of unification with Germany, but the winners of the Great War, England, France, and the United States in particular, had forbidden it. This did not matter to Hitler, who was increasingly defiant towards the Western powers. On March 12, 1938, the Germans marched their men and tanks through the streets of Vienna, announcing that Austria would now be part of the Third Reich. This became known as the Anschluss, meaning annexation. The Austrians offered no resistance, and much of the population cheered the union between the two countries. Those of Aryan descent had reason to do so, as they now belonged to a more advanced and powerful nation, elevating their race above all others. But the Jewish population, communists, and others deemed undesirable would soon realize the terror of living under the Nazi yoke. Two days after the annexation, the Gestapo, the German secret police, set up an office in the Austrian capital. From there, they oversaw the thousands of arrests that took place in the new territory. Initially, prisoners were deported to the Dachau concentration camp, established in the south of Germany and one of the first such centers. This was where the most vocal political dissidents, Jews, Roma, homosexuals, and common criminals ended up. But the large number of inmates soon led the Nazi authorities to plan the construction of another camp within the territory of Austria. In March 1938, men from the SS, the German organization in charge of the security of these inhuman places, chose the site where the infamous Mauthausen concentration camp would be erected. A few months later, it became operational. Those held there were forced to work in the quarries of the area, extracting granite in unsanitary conditions, with little food, water, or rest hours. Deaths were not long in coming. After the Anschluss, the Germans continued to add territory to their growing empire, now with the acquisition of certain regions of what was Czechoslovakia. Although Hitler also defied the European powers in doing so, he met no resistance. But this was about to change. On September 1st, 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland, and this time the locals fought back, thus beginning World War II. However, the Poles could do little to stop the German advance, and they had to sign the surrender a month after hostilities began. The Gestapo and other security forces were quick to implement the protocol they had already carried out in Austria. Jews and other enemies of the Reich were reported en masse and sent to the various concentration camps spread throughout German territory and that of its conquests. The growing number of prisoners forced the Germans to also expand the facilities within the centers, establishing sub-camps. One of them, perhaps the most brutal, was Gusen, just 5 kilometers from Mauthausen. Originally established to increase the productivity of the slave laborers at the camp, it was located closer to the quarries where they carried out their forced labor. By January 1940, there were already 400 prisoners held there, including a number of Poles, both civilians and captured soldiers, as well as Austrians brought from Mauthausen. As expected, the people who worked at Gusen did so in terrible conditions, under the constant cruelty of the SS guards. The cold at that time was devastating, often reaching sub-zero temperatures. Even so, the prisoners had no access to coats or even gloves to protect their hands with which they mined the quarries. The fires that were lit for warmth were only for the Nazis, and anyone who got too close to them risked being beaten. Between December 1939 and April 1940, nearly 2,000 people died working at Gusen, most of them victims of the brutal conditions to which they were subjected by their captors. Others also died directly from out-of-hand beatings or outright summary executions. These practices, so common in the following years of the war, were not yet so established among the guards. But this did not mean that they never happened. SS members were chosen for their cruelty, and they never missed an opportunity to vent their fury on the prisoners. In addition to torture by the Germans, they also had to deal with the Kapos. This was the name given to prisoners who collaborated with the Nazis, and they supervised the common inmates. They were often more cruel than the guards themselves, showing off the little power they had there.
Some of the Kapos inside of Gusen were infamous for their brutality. For example, one named Wolf executed prisoners by hanging them, and then also stamped on their bodies. Another took part in gassing inmates.
Mauthausen and its sub-camp Gusen were the only camps in the entire Nazi territory designated as Category 3. This was the worst classification, stating that all those sent there were criminals with no hope of being re-established in society. Their guards were therefore explicitly allowed to work them until they dropped dead, and to be as brutal as they wanted. At Gusen, conditions were even worse than at the main camp. Between 1940 and 1941, the life expectancy of prisoners was barely 6 months. The incredible shortage of food meant that the average weight of prisoners was barely 40 kilograms. Deaths from starvation reached levels unimaginable. Added to this was the poor hygiene of the place. The detainees were hardly given the opportunity to wash themselves, so the barracks were in a constant state of filth, making it prone to the spread of disease. Added to the prisoners' low defenses due to Gusen's non-existent nutrition, epidemics soon took their first toll. At the end of 1941, people began to fall ill with typhus, something very common in German concentration camps. The infected numbered in the thousands, but the Germans never made any effort to cure them. Instead, anyone who showed symptoms was separated from the rest and executed, either by firing squad or euthanasia. That was the only solution the Nazis were willing to offer. While it may seem counterproductive that as Gusen was a forced labor camp, the Germans were so willing to eliminate its labor force, there is an explanation for this. The reality was that even though these tasks were carried out, their primary function was the extermination of its population. But unlike others, such as Auschwitz, the main method of mass murder was not the gas chamber, but labor exploitation. Prisoners literally worked themselves to death in the granite quarries. As one group died, others were brought in from different concentration centers, keeping the number of detainees roughly constant, generally around 6,000 or 7,000. This number exceeded the capacity of Gusen, which had been planned for around 5,000 people at most. The overcrowding added to the terrible conditions already mentioned above to make this camp a living hell, as one survivor recounts next.
Life in hospital was very hard for us because we had no medical cures and we had very little food to eat. We were kept in small rooms, 3, 4 in one bed, with very much dirt and no possibility to wash. And we had very often very many died every day. In our room, for instance, about 50 men we were, and each day 3 or 4 men used to die. Sometimes even more than that.
From almost its opening until early 1943, Gusen was run by Commandant Karl Chmielewski. According to survivors' accounts, he was an extremely cruel man who enjoyed torturing the prisoners in his charge. Instead of delegating tasks, he himself beat, abused, and murdered the people held there. It was quite normal for him to do this while completely intoxicated. Under his rule, life at Gusen was characterized by violence and sadism. Half of those sent there died during his brutal regime. In 1943, he was replaced as commandant by Friedrich August Seidler, who did not approve of his predecessor's indiscriminate and arbitrary punishments. But if the prisoners thought that this would end their ordeal, they were gravely mistaken. Seidler preferred what he called Prussian-style brutality, in which he administered martial-style punishments to anyone who broke his rules, as if they were members of the military. Instead of beatings, prisoners who broke Nazi rules were now subjected to whippings, for example. The end result, however, was often death, as was the case with Chmielewski. Another common punishment was the removal of the day's rations in a place where a meal could mean the difference between life and death. For major offenses, such as escape attempts or assaults on guards, the prisoner was sentenced to the firing squad. The number of those killed may have decreased under Seidler's rule, but Gusen remained a brutal and sadistic place until the end of the war. Even macabre experiments on prisoners were carried out. It was common for the Nazis to test new medicines or drugs in the concentration camps, as they did not care if the tests went wrong and the person died. The best known of the Nazi doctors was Josef Mengele, who carried out most of his dark experiments at Auschwitz. In Gusen, they were under the supervision of the physician Helmuth Fetter. Beginning in 1944, the Nazis conducted tests to study the effects of tuberculosis on the forced patients, with the aim of developing cures. To do this, infected pus was injected into the lungs of healthy people. The victims were then forced to run non-stop for hours on end until they collapsed from exhaustion. Completely weakened, benzene, one of the components of gasoline, was injected into their lungs, causing a slow, agonizing death. Throughout this torture, the effects were closely studied. Besides being horribly cruel, these tests were useless, as no useful results were achieved. It was simply another way of adding useless deaths to the Germans' long tally. After the murder, the bodies were taken to the crematorium, which was soon overwhelmed by the number of bodies.
The general and his party next see the crude woodland crematory, actually a grill made of railway tracks. Here, the bodies of victims were cremated. Charred remains of several inmates still lay heaped atop the grill.
The SS guards also arranged certain distractions from their duties, all with a dark side. On Sundays, for example, football matches were organized between the captives for the enjoyment of the members of the security team. The participants received more rations, but the exhausting exercise and the state of hunger in which they were often found often ended up weakening them even more, which did not bother their captors at all. In 1942, a brothel was also opened in Gusen for the exclusive use of Germans. The aim of this was to prevent the guards from having relations with the male prisoners, since homosexuality was seen as a crime and an aberration. In the brothel, 10 female captives considered to be Aryan were selected and coerced into working there. In return, they were promised that after a time they would be released, but none were. Most ended up being forced to join the female SS Corps when the war began to turn against Germany. It was mentioned earlier that Gusen's main function was to exterminate those deemed undesirable. Those selected for death at Mauthausen were also sent there. As soon as they arrived, the guards made them run to check their physical condition. Those who could not keep up were eliminated in various ways. This was the fate of a third of the first 10,000 prisoners transferred to Gusen. gas chambers were built here only at the end of the war. The guards resorted to more inventive and cruel ways of killing the captives. One of them, widely used in the winter, was to force people to stand all night in the open air, without shelter or food. Sometimes they were even ordered to strip. It was normal for half of them not to survive until morning. Those who did, incredibly weakened, usually died within the next day. One method uniquely used at Gusen was the death baths. Prisoners were forced to stand under extremely cold showers until they died. Drains were blocked, so the water level continually rose. If the person tried to avoid being covered in the liquid, the guards did the dirty work themselves and drowned them. This agonizing process could take hours. It was as inefficient as it was cruel and was never used elsewhere. This did not stop German sadists from continuing to use death baths, although they often falsified records to attribute another cause to the prisoner's death.
Yes, the SS sanitaire took the people in the bathroom there, and with cold water, 20 minutes. During 20 minutes, he made a cold bath.
A cold bath, yes.
Whipping and,
There was an SS
and knocking and knocking.
Yes, the SS man himself.
The SS man himself, you understand? And next day, we had many casualties, and a third of these people were dead.
In 1945, during the final months of the war in Europe, a gas chamber similar to those used in other camps, albeit of a smaller capacity, was designed. It was rarely used, and only about 1,100 deaths are attributed to it. Total murders at Gusen reached over 35,000 people, with about a third of these occurring in the last year of the war. By this time, approximately 25,000 prisoners were housed at Gusen. Most were suffering from some kind of disease, whether it was tuberculosis, pneumonia, or typhus. Almost all were in a terrible state of malnutrition, extremely thin and weak. They were known as Musulman by the German guards. Due to the overcrowding of the camp, they were forced to sleep 3 to a bunk, which only increased the spread of epidemics. With the end of the war approaching, the top authorities at Gusen decided to eliminate all prisoners from the camp once and for all. To do this, they had the terrible idea of sending them into the quarry tunnels, and once there, detonating them with dynamite, locking them inside. Explosives were placed at 2 of the 5 entrances, but fortunately, the Nazi chain of command collapsed and the order to carry out this mass killing never arrived. In the first days of May 1945, with the Führer already dead, several of the SS guards began to desert their posts, since they saw no reason to continue carrying out his directives. Gradually, the prisoners realized that there was no one left to control them, and that they were practically free. Those who were in better condition left Gusen, entering Austrian territory in search of help. Many others, however, were too weak to move. Fortunately for them, American soldiers arrived at the concentration camp on May 5th. The few remaining SS members did not hesitate to surrender. Yet as they entered Gusen, the Americans encountered horrific scenes. Not only were there many dead whose bodies were never cremated, but also the few survivors, many of whom had gone mad, were killing each other with the weapons the Nazis had left behind. In addition, the weakest had been locked in the barracks by the guards as a final act of cruelty, without access to food or water. By the time the Allies managed to unlock the doors, the vast majority had already died. They also witnessed how the prisoners executed those accused of collaborating with the Nazis by their own hand. Several of these committed suicide when they saw the bloodthirsty mobs advancing on them, while the rest were mercilessly murdered. After order was restored, investigations began to accuse those most responsible for the cruelties that occurred there. Dr. Vetter, in charge of the tuberculosis experiments, was sentenced to death. Chmielewski managed to escape and live under a false identity until 1959, when he was discovered and sent to prison for life. Several were tried and faced harsh sentences, but it is a fact that most of the guards at Gusen, many of whom were directly responsible for murders, ended their days free. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the most infamous and brutal concentration camp in all of Nazi Germany. over 1 million people were killed within its walls, either in the gas chambers or shot by sadistic guards. Living conditions were horrendous, with many prisoners perishing from cold, hunger, and disease. The corpses exceeded the capacity of the crematoria that operated day and night, filling the killing center with smoke and ash. Life there was short and cruel, and only a few of those who entered were fortunate enough to be free again. Today, in this new military history video, we will show you full-color images, like you have never seen before, that reflect how brutal it was to live in the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. Poland was invaded by Germany on September 1st, 1939, thus beginning World War II. Within a month, the Nazis had swept away the defenders, and by October 6th, the entire country was under their control. Tens of thousands of soldiers were made prisoners of war, and civilians imprisoned by the Germans were also taken. These included politicians, intellectuals, journalists, artists, and many more who formed the elite of the nation's society. But now the Germans were faced with a dilemma. They needed a place to house them until they decided what to do with them. Near the town of Oswiecim, or Auschwitz in German, were barracks that had previously been used by Polish forces. There, the Nazis found the perfect place to establish the infamous concentration camp where millions of people would be murdered. It was in a sparsely populated area, but at the intersection of railroad tracks, which would facilitate the transportation of people. The first center built was called Auschwitz I, which had 22 one- or two-story buildings inside. Initially, about 700 Polish prisoners were sent there. But as the months passed, as the Nazis increased their conquests across Europe, more and more men and women were transferred. The camp was overwhelmed, so the German guards put the new arrivals to work. The number of buildings was expanded, and in those that only had one floor, an additional floor was added. The working conditions were brutal, with little food and almost no time for rest. The German guards, all members of the cruel SS, frequently tortured the weakest, making them work until they fell exhausted. Although the camp had not yet been converted into an extermination center, they did not care if their captives died. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and within a few months they conquered hundreds of kilometers of territory, along with all the people who lived there.
Hitler, he saw world Jewry as a threat to the German race. Right? Hitler's thinking about this in terms of biology. He also sees communism as a threat to Western civilization. And from Hitler's perspective, and many of those in the Nazi leadership, Jews were behind the Soviet threat. The Jew equaled a Bolshevik, so if he was able to destroy the Soviet Union, he could kill two birds with one stone.
Due to the invasion, the Nazis again had thousands of prisoners to be imprisoned, and many of them were sent to Auschwitz. The population of 700 had, in just 1 year, grown to approximately 11,000. Not only were there Poles now, but also Jews, Slavs, Roma, communists, and many others, branded by the Nazis as inferior and subhuman. In October 1941, construction began on Auschwitz II, better known as Birkenau. The Germans intended that this new facility would be able to house over 30,000 people. Again, prisoners were used for the construction. Much of the work was done during the harsh Polish winter. Prisoners were forced to sleep in the barracks as they were built, and because the roof was the last thing to be put on, they had no protection from the merciless weather. Weakened by months of terrible conditions, many did not survive the cold. Exhaustion, hunger, and beatings by the Germans killed several others. The German murder machine was beginning to oil its gears, so in addition to the barracks, 4 gas chambers were built that would be used for a dark purpose. Unlike Auschwitz, the first Birkenau had been designed primarily as an extermination center and would soon be operational. At the beginning of 1942, Adolf Hitler and the rest of the Nazi leaders began to discuss the best way to consolidate their macabre plan. The time had come to employ the final solution, with which they sought to wipe out the Jewish population housed in the concentration camps. To do so, they would begin using the gas chambers built immediately. Auschwitz, due to its large size and number of people held there, became one of the deadliest centers in the entire Third Reich. As soon as they got off the train, the prisoners were separated into 2 large groups by SS guards. The healthiest looking were shaved, tattooed with an identification number, and sent to the barracks. The weakest, including the elderly, pregnant women, and children, were almost without exception sent to the gas chambers. The smoke rising from the chimneys was a constant reminder to the other prisoners of the fate that awaited them if their performance began to falter.
היה איזה מין מבנה כזה ששומרים עומדים בזה. ושם חיכינו איזה שעה, 2, 3. כמובן, אני מדברת שתמיד המלווים הגרמנים, זה לא... אחרי שעה, 2 אמרו לשבת. אחרי 2 לקום. אחר כך עשינו סיבוב. ועוד פעם, שידור חוזר, לשבת, לקום, ועוד פעם, עוד שם. עד שהיה כבר מאוחר בלילה, וחזרנו לבלוק. ואז נתברר שהבלוק הזה היה מועמד להשמדה, אבל התקלקל הקרמטוריום. בשביל זה אני מספרת לכם.
The woman we just heard about was saved from a terrible death, but she had to remain a prisoner in this camp, where life was an endless agony. The barracks where they slept had been designed for 700 prisoners each, but with the constant flow of new captives, they ended up piling up many more, almost twice as many as planned. Some buildings did not even have beds, and there were only straw mattresses where fleas and other pests abounded. Sometimes, even that was missing, and the only option was to sleep on the hard, cold floor. The coal stove was not enough to heat the place. Many died due to these brutal conditions. The prisoners were awakened early by the guards, before the sun came up. Already at 5 in the morning, they had to be up for their breakfast. This consisted of an infusion of herbs or water boiled with grains as a substitute for coffee. It is not known what the origin was, but it was so bitter that many could not stomach it or refused it, even if it was one of the few meals offered. If they were lucky, they might be given a piece of bread. Then the SS men would take them out of the barracks to form lines for roll call. If someone took longer than allowed, or if the count did not add up to the expected number, this procedure could sometimes last for hours. It did not matter if it was raining or snowing. It was another time when the sadistic Germans could torture their prisoners. There were times when some people, so weakened by all their experiences, died during roll call, falling exhausted to the frozen ground. This, far from ending the matter, only made it last even longer. When the Germans were finally satisfied, they ordered them to march to their work detachments. Many worked making war products, such as vehicle parts or weapons. Others were employed by companies such as Bayer, Siemens, and IG Farben to increase their wealth. In fact, Auschwitz III, also called Monowitz, was built by the latter company to create synthetic rubber. This and other companies took advantage of slave labor, paying the Nazi government to employ the prisoners. Many were also used to expand the concentration camp, which always needed to house more captives, or in the coal mines outside the camp. Some women were taken to warehouses where they separated the valuable belongings of the captives, such as clothes and jewelry. Although they were theoretically sold to provide funds to the government, many of these items were appropriated by the guards as gifts for their wives. Workdays could last 11 hours or more. Any mistakes made were often brutally punished by the guards, either by taking away lunch, beating them, or even summarily executing them. The food given consisted of soup with potatoes, grains, and flour. As with breakfast, many vomited it, leaving them weaker for the rest of the day. Hunger was a constant companion for the inhabitants of Auschwitz, and malnutrition killed almost as many as the gas chambers.
Food was brought to us in barrels, wooden barrels. It was a heavy, thick vegetable concoction of soup. We were given what you might call a liter of it, one scoop, into a dish, into a bowl. I remember it was a maroon-colored bowl that we always wore. It was hanging from the belt together with a spoon. You didn't dare lose it, because without that you didn't eat.
In a place like this, everyone had to think about their own survival. After the workday was over, the prisoners were escorted back to the barracks. They were tasked with carrying the bodies of those who had died during the day to be burned. Dinner was not much better than lunch, consisting mostly of bread, and sometimes accompanied by a small piece of meat or cheese. By mid-1942, the Germans realized that tens of thousands of prisoners were dying from lack of food and were forced to improve these conditions. This was not due to a humanitarian issue, but merely a practical one. They were running out of sources of forced labor. However, this was not the case for the Jews and the Soviets, who had been marked for total extermination. They continued to suffer extreme hunger until their captivity ended. By the end of 1942, the final solution was in full operation. Many prisoners from other camps were sent to Birkenau to be killed there, as it had numerous gas chambers built for this macabre purpose. When they arrived, to prevent panic, they were told that the rooms they were sent to were for disinfection. But when the doors were closed, the Germans activated the gas, which was a pesticide called Zyklon B. Immediately, people began banging on the walls and begging for mercy, but it was all in vain. Minutes later, the screams stopped, and certain selected prisoners entered to remove the bodies. By 1944, it is estimated that approximately 20,000 people were killed in this way per day. The incinerators often could not cope with the number of corpses, and they piled up, rotting or freezing depending on the time of year. Executions, however, did not only occur in the gas chambers. The guards were given explicit permission to unleash their fury on the prisoners. Any slightest infraction was severely punished, and these tortures often ended in the death of the victim. The prisoners barely reacted when a fellow prisoner was shot in the head, as the Germans had accustomed them to such crimes. Within Auschwitz, Block 11 had been designated solely for punishment. According to reports, having one's hands in one's pockets and daring to ask for a second ration of food were the most common reasons for people being sent there. Within this block, SS men would whip offenders with whips or hang them on metal hooks until they were off the ground. They would even hold their heads inside chimneys, indifferent to their screams of pain. If the prisoner was too weak after his torture, he was sent to the gas chamber without a second thought. Block 10 was another section of Auschwitz designed for sadistic use. This was where German doctors performed their experiments on prisoners who were used as guinea pigs. As well as eliminating those deemed inferior, they also sought to prohibit them from reproducing. Tests were run to find an effective sterilizer. Many women were exposed to high doses of X-rays to test their effect. Many others were injected with dangerous chemicals that would render their wombs incapable of bearing children. Several died in these trials, or were so damaged that they were no longer of any use to the Nazis and were sent straight to the gas chambers. Outside of sterilization, other experiments were also carried out. In Block 10 of Auschwitz, Josef Mengele carried out his dark tests for which he became infamous. Any prisoner with dwarfism or hereditary diseases was sent to a barracks reserved for him, as were the twin brothers. The Nazi scientist was obsessed with these conditions, so he carried out a large number of tests on these people. When he had obtained the information he sought, he would kill them and then dissect them. Tens of thousands entered his laboratory, but only a few survived.
One day I became extremely ill after a visit to the lab, and I was taken to a barrack that was filled with practically living dead.
So there you are, a living dead person, knowing it.
Well, Mengele came in every morning and every evening, twice a day, with 4 other doctors, and he declared, very sarcastically laughing, "Too bad, she's so young. She has only 2 weeks to live."
Right in front of you.
Right in front of me.
Of the 3,000 twins Mengele experimented on, only 150 survived until the camp's liberation. The woman we hear about was one of the lucky few. The Auschwitz chambers continued to operate until October 1944, murdering tens of thousands of people every day. But the Nazis knew they did not have much time left. The Soviet Red Army was rapidly approaching Poland, having put the Germans on the run the previous year. SS guards, anticipating that Hitler would lose the war, did not want any evidence of what had happened in the concentration camp to remain. The chambers and crematoria were demolished, along with many of the barracks and high-ranking officers' offices. All records of arrivals, executions, and torture were destroyed. But hundreds of thousands of prisoners were still alive. Some Germans wanted to kill them, but others still saw them as labor, or even as hostages to negotiate with the Soviets or the rest of the Allies. It was thus decided to transfer the captives into the interior of the Reich, to place them in other concentration camps.
Anybody who couldn't march, couldn't follow, was shot, and the body was thrown on the side of the road.
Some of us were very sick, and we didn't know whether we will make it.
The Nazis did not have vehicles to move such a large number of people, so transport was done on foot. These death marches, as they were later known, took place in winter, with temperatures dipping below 0 degrees. Thousands of weakened prisoners, who had not eaten well for years and were without warm clothing, died on the way due to the merciless cold. Those who fell too far behind were in turn executed by the Nazis. It is believed that of the approximately 60,000 who were there at the start of the march, about 15,000 fell victim to the weather or gunfire. Auschwitz was liberated on January 27, 1945 by the Soviets. When they entered the camp, only 7,000 prisoners were still alive, most too weakened to understand that they had been liberated from the Nazis. More than 1 million people, including Jews, Slavs, Roma, and others, died there. Because of the staggering number of deaths, it is one of the most famous concentration camps and an example of the cruelty to which the Nazi regime reached. But despite the Germans' attempts to denigrate them, many of these captives never lost their humanity. They held meetings to celebrate their religion, culture, and festivities throughout the years of imprisonment. They helped each other, sharing food and other goods, even knowing the fate that would await them if they were discovered by the guards. There were even rebellions, which, despite having failed, showed the unbeatable spirit of these people. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, what impacts you the most about the history of Auschwitz? Leave us your answer in the comments box below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.